Great, welcome everyone. Good morning. I'm Molly Cobb, an honorary research fellow here at the University of Liverpool. We're very pleased to be holding this event this year and building on previous events that have come before, and quite pleased to continue to welcome renowned authors here to talk about their work with us. Part of us able to do this is from our sponsors, so I do want to thank Student Roost and Bruntwood for continuing to sponsor the event this year. If you're not already aware, Quillem is kindly going to be signing books after the event downstairs, where you can also buy his book as well if you haven't already. We do ask that you do let Quillem leave the hall first, just so he can get downstairs and set up and be ready for you. So if you could just give him a bit of a head start, would be appreciated. There will also be time for questions at the end of the event. And we will have microphones for that. We do ask that you just wait for the microphone to get to you before you ask the question, just so that we can be sure everyone can hear you. So all of that being said then, I do want to properly introduce Quillem McBreen, author of the Tenets of Truth, and a local author as well, here from Liverpool. So thank you very much for taking the time to do this with us today.
You're welcome, and thanks for hosting.
Of course. So I think the first thing we're going to start with is Quillem is going to do a bit of a reading from the book, from the prologue actually, just to kind of set you up. If you've read the book already, of course you'll be familiar with it, and if you haven't, then it'll give you a good introduction to the book itself and what comes later. So like I said, it is part of the prologue. It sets up one of the main characters as well that you return to later. Gives a bit of action, a bit of intrigue, a bit of magic, but also unexpected loss of magic, which is one of those mysteries that the prologue does very well to sort of set you up, to draw you in, make you want to continue reading, you want to know what's going to happen, which is a great aspect of the prologue. I remember when I first read the prologue, and it was just immediately an introduction to this world that you just definitely want to know more about. You definitely want to see where everything's going, who these people are, what they're doing. But it will be far more interesting for Quillem to read it than for me to describe it to you. So I will hand over for him to do the reading.
Okay, so in this section, we're following the story of a bounty hunter who's sent on a mission to find somebody, and this is him kind of arriving at that area or that sequence. In front, at a large wooden table, sat a fat man in his late middle cycles, noisily eating from a bowl of bread and beans. He looked up when Sentenza swung the door closed, and at once stopped. He put down the spoon and seemed to rearrange himself, sitting up a little straighter in the wooden chair. Looking away from Sentenza, the man towelled away a morsel of his stew, gave a satisfied belch, and took a slurped gulp from a tankard of what seemed like rough ale. "What are you doing here?" he said at last, placing the tankard back down with an unexpected care. "You don't even knock?" The fat man's voice was lazy. Words tripped against each other and dripped from his mouth like spittle. "You've done a good job avoiding me, Belir," Sentenza answered, slowly crossing the room. He kept his manner light and easy, nothing too ugly too early. He took a seat opposite his reluctant host. "It's not always wise for a man to let himself be found," Belir answered, eyeing him warily. "I'll ask again, why are you here?" "You should know why I'm here. You know what I do." Belir's eyes twitched, a slight movement over Sentenza's shoulder. He swiveled in his chair to find one of the boys standing in the doorway. Sentenza placed him at 14, maybe 15 cycles at best. Still, old enough to be a problem. "Alir, go help your mother," Belir commanded. "I have an old friend here for a chat, and we don't want bothering." The boy left without a word, cold eyes never leaving the old friend. "Cute family," Sentenza said with a smile. He helped himself to a hunk of bread. "I didn't think you'd have had time. How long has it been? 5, maybe 6 cycles? I'll tell you what, though. You've done well enough for yourself here, landed on your feet, so to speak. Must take a lot of work, just you and the wife and those boys. No one else here to help you, hey? Takes a lot of planning, something like this." He reached forward, taking the tankard, and helped himself to a long mouthful. It was strong and gritty, but surprisingly cold. "Now look here, Sentenza. You can tell Sakani that I never planned anything, Berlier said. Sentenza smiled. You took off pretty quick. Sakani doesn't like it when people walk out on him in the middle of a job, especially when that someone has a whole pack of things belonging to him and the church. He let the words hang in the air. Berlier sat silent for a moment, just looking at Sentenza, assessing the situation. Beads of sweat glistened on his wide forehead. Then, to Sentenza's surprise, the man laughed, a short little guffaw that threw the other man off. Listen, he said, relaxing back into the chair. If that's all this is, I can pay the money back. He made to stand. Let me shout the boy. He can go get... Sit down, Berlier, Sentenza said sharply. Sakani doesn't pay me to act as bailiff. You should know that. But Sentenza, Berlier implored, spreading his stubby hands in submissive gesture. But nobody. I've got a job to do, just like everyone else. Sentenza took off his hat, laying it down onto the table in front of him. His eyes met Berlier's. There was far less fear there than he'd hoped for. But maybe that was for the best. Less messy that way. Less pleading. We go back a long way, Berlier. You go back a long way, Berlier said, a slight whine to his voice. Just let me sort things out here. But Sentenza didn't respond. He took another drink. Things aren't what they seem, Berlier gestured to their surroundings, urging him to take it all in. The money isn't why I left. Truth, I hardly even need the money here. Look at this place. I have everything I could ever want. It should be the middle of winter, and go look outside. Go ahead. He pointed to the window. You must have seen on the way in, cattle in the field, corn in the sheds. He was talking quickly now, fat chins quivering. I still have most of the cash. It's yours, all of it. I don't need it. Sentenza raised a single eyebrow. It was an interesting offer. Berlier was still gazing at him, and he was unsure if this was an act of defiance or submission. Finally, Sentenza sighed. In truth, I don't think it was the money that bothered him, do you? You betrayed his trust, Berlier. You got greedy. You took something that he actually cared for. He looked about, letting his shoulders relax as he gestured about the room with his tankard. Look at all this. Do you think it can all be that simple? You know why I'm here. You've got one chance to tell me what I want to know. Where is she? The man's watery grey orbs flickered, not much, but enough to give a warning. A soft click came from behind, and Sentenza kicked down hard, throwing himself and the chair he was sitting in to his right. A clunking twang and a hiss, and something zipped and puckered the air to his left. Instinctively, he rolled onto his side and reached out, first with his hand and then beyond, or at least that's what he tried to do. He'd performed the act countless times before. Why had nothing happened? There should be something there, he screamed to himself, a force or power that lay just beyond his hand, waiting for him to tap into as he had done all his life. His heart skipped, empty fingers fumbling uselessly in the air. There was no time. He forced the panic down and rolled his hand whipping down to one of the short blades that he carried at his belt. I'll have to do this the old-fashioned way, he thought. He pulled the dirk free, drawing onto his knees. The arm arced and swung upwards, snapping taut with sudden force. He released his grip, sending the blade swimming neatly across the kitchen. A wet thud signaled his success. Sentenza rose to his full height and strode forward to where Berlier's eldest son lay bleeding on the floor, blade sunk in his chest. The young man's slippery fingers clasped at the hilt clumsily. Breath came hard in short, desperate gasps. Then all at once, he was done. The body dropped, hazelnut eyes losing their pain and anger, drifting into the lifeless void. Sentenza stopped to retrieve both the knife and the crossbow, surprised that such an antique could still function. Almost as big as the boy is, he thought. Or was, he corrected himself. An anger flared in him. He could have killed me with that thing. Turning back, he saw that the boy's quarrel had flown right past his now vacant chair. Wood lay split and splintered where the bolt had hammered through the table and pierced the boy's father as if he were a hunted boar. Blood seeped from the deep wound in Berlier's stomach, and his hands fixed against the table, his teeth grinding. Sentenza straightened, fixing the man with a glare. Berlier braced, knuckles white with effort. He coughed, blood splattering down his chin. Sentenza dropped the crossbow and moved slowly back to the table. He placed a hand on the edge, resting his weight there. Berlier's eyes bulged, the barbed head of the bolt sinking further into the man's ruptured flesh. A dull shout rumbled through him in broken stages. That's no way to treat an old friend. Sentenza's voice was cold and hard.
Thank you. I do hope anyone who hasn't read the book takes that as an invitation to find out more and definitely read the rest of it. So one thing with the prologue, as I said, it does set up, obviously the rest of the book is the prologue, but you introduce these characters, this setting, these locations, and it's something that's quite key through most of the book is you've developed and built these locations, and they're very real. They feel very real when you're reading them and you're sort of being, having them described to you. How did you sort of go about planning those or coming up with those locations and those kinds of settings?
Well, I suppose with something like the prologue, I'm not a writer in terms of I don't have a writing background. I studied biochemistry, so I'm science in my background really, although I now work for Liverpool City Council. So none of this really touches my real working life or my day-to-day life. However, I'd always had a real urge to write. So I think I just sat down one day and decided, if I keep thinking about it, I will never do it. So I need to just go out and break that. Although I thought that every time I went to put pen to paper, I'd stop myself because I thought you needed to have the full story set out before you even started writing. I thought you had to have every part of the book planned, every word, every aspect, how one page flows into the next, how one sentence flows into the next, and I really didn't have that at all. I had an idea, I had a feeling and an expression of what I wanted to do. I possibly knew where I wanted to start and where I wanted to end, or I didn't have the full structure. And I just decided one day, I need to, and if I don't even try, I will never know what happens. So, very much so, the writing of the prologue, for me, whenever I read it or while I was writing it, it very much was the start of a spaghetti western. And in my head, it's probably Santander in my head is Lee Van Cleef. So he's there at the opening of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and it's almost that scene, but reimagined with magic and the different people, obviously, and the different things that they're going to look for. But that's how it all started out. As I was thought, I'm going to write a spaghetti western, but instead of guns, they have magic and crossbows and bows and arrows. So that's where it all kind of started from, and then it just progressed from there. I'm very much not a plotter, so in writing it's one of these things that people call plotting and pantsing. So when you're a pantser, which is what I am mostly, you write by the seat of your pants, hence the pantsing. So that's what I do. Each chapter, I know how I want it to feel. I know the overarching themes. I know that I want to get something to somewhere or someone to somewhere, and that I have a message to deliver in that chapter. So that's what I do. And very much each chapter that I'd come home after writing or I'd finish, and I'd often sit and think, I did not know that was going to happen. I was so excited. It was such an exciting and escapist process because it was all completely new. And I think especially because I didn't have a background in writing, so it wasn't formulaic for me. The most plotting that I really did was I'd draw diagrams. So in the diagram there would be, probably based on a world map, a very rough world map, mostly on whiteboards in the office after work. I'd stay behind and draw pictures of where the characters and where they needed to be into the world. Because the book follows 4 main characters as they weave their way through the world. And they're just normal people, and it's how the world itself forces them throughout their life. And so they're very disparate. And I know that at some point I'd need to get certain people together to progress to the next part of what I wanted them to do and what message that I wanted them to portray. And at one point I would need to get them all together in a certain place. So that was how I went about the writing process, really, in that kind of situation. So it was very, very organic, and I think that's one of the reasons that it worked so well for me, is because of that organic nature and that unstructured nature. It made it very, very exciting for me as well.
Yeah, it was as you mentioned, that not having that writing background, I was going to say, seems like it was quite beneficial for you to not sort of have that idea of, oh, I must do it this way or I must do that, because that's how other people have done it. It seems quite beneficial that you've actually sort of come into it with no sort of sense of just, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write this, and I'm going to do it the way that feels best to you, basically, to come out with what you've ultimately done.
Yeah, and in some ways it is daunting, definitely, because you know at some stage you're going to be up against all of these people, and you don't really know what the process should be, and very, very naive in terms of, I thought always that, okay, you get your book, you write the book, and that's it, it's done. You move on to the next book. But that's not the process whatsoever. So as I found out quite heavily, really, finishing the book and then having to review the book, revisit it, redraft it, go through edits, go through those yourself and your self-editing process, then take it to somebody. That's a really, really difficult stage. At that stage is you then take it to somebody external who's a professional in some of these kind of work environments and say, this is my book, it's my first go, I'm not a writer, would you have a look at it and please be gentle and kind. And thankfully I did find, I found somebody, a local person in an editing company, the Liverpool editing company, and took it to them, the prologue and the first couple of chapters, and when they came back, they said to me, so could I ask about your writing background? So I said, no, well, that's it, you're holding it. She said, no, I get that this is the book that you're giving me, but can I ask where you did your writing course, your writing degree, your creative writing studies? Well, no, I didn't do any. I work for the council. I'm a biochemist. I do biochemistry studies. So that is all I've done. And she just looked and said, I'm really, really surprised. She said, there are fewer corrections and edits. There are fewer red lines on this than there were in my manuscript when I submitted for her first book. So that gave me real courage that I was doing the right thing at that stage, and that it wasn't just. It was something that I could continue doing and maybe progress to in the real world, rather than it just being an entertaining hobby for me, a little side distraction. So that really gave me the impetus to then go through the editing process, I suppose. If that hadn't have been a good position for me, I probably would have just carried on. I probably wouldn't have taken it to the next stage, and I would have just carried on doing this as an entertainment for myself, and maybe share it with a couple of friends, that kind of thing. But I certainly wouldn't have gone on to be an actual published writer.
Yeah, lucky that you did. But having said that, of course, I do want to ask, because you did mention you do have a full-time job that is not this. How did you sort of fit this in? Because as you mentioned yourself, this alongside writing the book itself, but then everything that came afterwards. How did you kind of manage to sort of fit all of that in? Because you, in a sense, you were kind of doing two full-time jobs at the same time.
Yeah, very, very much so. So the work that I do is quite intense anyway, and I work in security and CCTV in that kind of world. So it's 24-hour operations, so there's staff in all the time, and I manage those staff. So it's quite. It takes a lot in terms of doing that. So it takes a lot of time to do that, and then fitting the book in alongside of that was really difficult. So what I would do is, on a couple of days a week, I would finish work when my boss finished, and we'd walk to a car. She'd get in the car, she'd go home, and then I'd sneak back into the office. So rather than going home, where I thought if I go home, I'm just going to get into the usual routine of cooking dinner, eating dinner, watching TV. So no, I'll actually go back to the office, pretend I'm still at work, and carry on writing until there is a thing where computers automatically switch off at a certain time of night to save energy. So I'd write until that happened, save work, and it could literally be, I would have to save in the middle of a sentence because I got the 5-second warning to say you're about to be turned off, save your work, and then go home. Great, okay. But it was a good cut-off because it meant I could then do that. And then the next time, I'm very, very lucky because the next time that I would go into the office to do that, I could pick up pretty much where I left off without really worrying too much. I went back to book 2 that I'm writing at the moment, and literally I hadn't managed to pick it up for about 3 weeks, but when I got to the stage of writing, I knew exactly where I was up to and what the next sentence almost was going to be without having to reread it. So I'm very, very fortunate in doing that, and I know that that's not normally the case for people, and they have to go back and they have to have a structure in where they do it. So I'm very fortunate in that kind of respect.
Yeah, definitely. Seems quite helpful to kind of have that almost sense of structure. Like you said, I work from here to here, and then sort of keeps you in it.
Yeah, and one of the other things is also I'm very fortunate because I am ginger. I don't sunbathe, so when we go on holiday, I don't sit there thinking, right, I now need to be in the sun. I just take my laptop, sit on the beach, and start writing. And we go to Portugal quite a lot. So whilst I'm there, sitting on the beach in Portugal, I don't think you can help but be influenced in like almost an osmosis. You take in all of the cultural references there. And I think that comes through in the book. There are lots of references to some of the places that I've been, some of the Portuguese elements of throughout the book. Lots of the names are Portuguese, Primeiro Amau, Bale Saw. Well, actually, Bale Saw is one of the places in the book, and it's one of the main towns where a lot of the action happens in the first section of the book. When I gave it to the audio narrator, we had a sit down, and he's a Northern Irish audio narrator, and when we went through the pronunciation of the names, so he was getting his head around a lot of the Portuguese kind of sounding names, Braga, Primeiro, Amau. Bale Saw, though, he could not get. He said, no, I'm sorry, it's an Irish name, it's Ballyseer. So we've kept it in the book as Ballyseer. But there are so many places within the book as well. The walled city within the book is very much based on a place in Portugal that I visit regularly called Óbidos. There's a scene where one of the main characters, one of the protagonists, is kind of entombed within these tunnels that he has to go through, and he has to make kind of situational decisions about his life. And that very much features as a place in Sintra, which is the old capital city of Portugal, a palace called Quinta da Regueira, a beautiful Manueline palace, and it has a grotto that's very steeped in Masonic lore. And within that, there is a grotto, a well that takes you deep into the ground, and people would go there under a certain moon of the year or of the month, and then they would have to go through, make a journey to find their rebirth into their Masonic life, and that's very much featured within the book. So there are lots of not only physical places, but also historical references. I think when you have somebody who does literary fiction, it's easier to, if you want to reference Plato, or you want to reference Pope Innocent III, or you want to reference the cry of Hidalgo for the Mexican Revolution, you just do it, you just say it. With fantasy fiction, those things didn't happen, not in that world. So when I want to reference those things, I have to create a city that has it, or I have to create a situation or a person that has all of these aspects that can then give a speech that is reminiscent or is a historical feature against something that's happened in the world. So that was really entertaining. That's part of the entertainment and exciting parts for me is, and I suppose this comes into the escapism of reading and writing, but what I would do is I would really enjoy the challenge of creating a person that was carrying the weight of a whole historical, cultural event, that massively world-changing event in our world. And then it's almost reliving that through the eyes of the person I've created. It's almost reliving that historical event itself, so such as there's a whole sequences that lead up and build towards a revolution, and so it's a great way for me to then feed in real world historical references, but it's also a challenge to completely rewrite and reimagine them. And I hope that some of that is, when you read it, you're able to do that as well, and vicariously live through those periods as well.
And is that something you found sort of particularly interesting about doing that? Because obviously it is fantasy. You could have literally made everything up. You could have created an absolutely, history that had nothing to do with ours at all. but you did kind of use sort of real-world locations or real-world ideas. Was that something that you were particularly keen to do, or did it just kind of come about?
I was keen to do it, and there's a time when I was talking to my dad, and I explained to my dad, we're around having a barbecue, family barbecue, and I said to him, writing a book. And he just looked at me and said, "You can't write, son." I thought, oh, well, thanks for the vote of confidence, Daddy, but no, I don't mean that. I don't mean you can't write. I mean, we can't write. They write. We don't write. They write. So I was thinking, oh, by them, you mean like them, the institution? Yeah, of course. He said, I'm reading a book at the moment. It's the girl who did something with the something, or the girl with the dragon tattoo. Yeah, that's the one. I'm reading that at the moment, and it's great. She's in a different country, and she goes from this place in this city, and she goes from this street to that street to this street. You don't know those streets. No, okay. So you need to get researchers. We can't afford researchers. We don't have the money. That's why they write, we don't write. And I thought about it and thought, well, do you not think that's why they created Google Maps? If I want to know those streets, I can just go out and have a look on Google Maps and see them. And I thought about it again, and I said, well, actually, Dad, I write in fantasy fiction. I've created a world, I've created characters, I've created a Bible and a religious system. Do you not think that if I wanted to create the name of a street, I'd just invent it? Which, at the time, it's one of those, it's an amusing little story that you might say, but I then revisited it in my head and I thought, actually, it's quite a sad indictment of a situation that people think we as working class people and families don't have the accessibility to go into a writing or to do anything because you don't have the resources and the backing. And very much it is a struggle to break into publishing and break into the world of writing because it's very controlled and very structured, and you have to do a lot of legwork to try and get to that place. And it's hard work when you have a full-time job and you're trying to do everything else around it. So I found that quite sad in some ways, and I think some of that also is reflected in the book, because the book is very much it's a book on one level, so you can read it as just a fantasy fiction, but there are also symbolisms within that and different things that you can read into it. It's a very much socialist book. It's like a critique on neoliberalism. At one respect, each of the different characters will have a different meaning. So the churchy characters are very much the media controlled or the state control aspect of things. The high lords are the elitism, so the aristocracy or the money people. Then you have the ordinary people, which are the main protagonists, who represent the hard-working middle classes, the lower classes, students who are learning and questioning. And then there's even one of them, Sentenza, is very much a criminal underbelly who doesn't really know which side he lies on. So there are those kind of layers within the book as well that are very much tried to find a second meaning within them to give this critique on the social structure. And then again, even to the degree of whenever there's an animal that's mentioned or a bird, very much birds actually, birds feature quite a lot, and trees and plants and herbs, all of them will have an actual symbolism within that. So you don't have a bird that's mentioned without it having some kind of crow being not. Crows are in there a fair amount because they are a warning of danger or foreboding or a forewarning of treachery on the trail. Ibis are mentioned in there now and again. They're very much a warning of death, and even there's a bird in there called the go-away bird, which is quite obvious what that means, and that's because its call it sounds like it's shouting "go away," and they're all set up as a foreboding or foreshadowing of things that are to come. Braga, one of the main characters, hears in the distance the go-away bird calling in the middle of the night before he goes on to see one of the really inciting events that happens in Bealsor or Ballyseer. So all of these things, the trees, yew trees and ash trees, they all have a symbolism within the book that give a foreshadowing of things that are about to come or things that will happen in this area. So as I say, it's easily accessible on one level to just read it as a fantasy yarn, and that's great. But there are also hidden layers within there. If you want to read into it, you can do, but there's no it's not necessary, but it might give a little extra boost to what the book is about.
It is all part of that world building that you've done to sort of build those layers and sort of have characters that develop and change in the way in which they interact with the world, and things like that throughout. Because part of that sort of social structure and the things that the church and things like that, to develop this kind of political aspect to what's going on in the church and the state, and sort of come back to that idea of the us and them kind of thing, where people sort of maybe exist in a certain social strata, and there's the expectation that that is where they stay, whereas you kind of take that and you, as you said, critique it in a way and try to build these characters that are sort of questioning things and building things. And that idea of truth is something that you obviously go on throughout the novel, but that idea of sort of a subjective truth, that truth doesn't have to be true, kind of?
Yeah, very much so. So, as in our real world, when you look at the media and what the media tells you, and you find actually there are so many layers within that in itself, we are given the truth that we believe because we're told the news outlets that are controlled by a certain group of families. That's the truth that you're being delivered or fed. And that's very much the same within the book. So each different chapter of the book starts off with a quote from the Tenets of Truth, which is the Bible in the story. And they start off very much kind of Old Testament quotes. I giveth unto you the church, says the goddess, that kind of thing. And they kind of set out a world belief or a religious belief at the start of each chapter. And in the first part of the book, first act, it's all very much based on the protagonist. So don't think you're even introduced to any of the antagonists until after the main inciting event. That kind of signals the end of Act 1. So all of these tenets give an absolutism. So like the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not do this. And in one way or another, one of the protagonists in that chapter will inadvertently break the tenet, not willfully, but because of the situation that the world has forced them into. So they might be put in a situation where they cannot get out of it themselves without hurting themselves or hurting somebody else, without breaking one of the rules of the church. And then when you move into Act 2 and you're introduced to the baddies, so to speak, who are, for all intents and purposes, the people who write and establish the tenets, because they're the churchy kind of people, or the high lords, they willfully break those tenets. So it's they will break those to willfully gain for themselves, not to actually just help out each other or to save themselves. There's a forced idea of, I am going to break this so that I can get better, or I can better myself. And the lower orders within the book, the four main protagonists, don't really have that choice. They have to do it, but they're then told, or their ideas of what the world has told them is the truth, as in the Bible truth, the religious truth. They're forced to accept that they're breaking it, and some of them really struggle with that. One of them is a young priest who's he's the one who's entombed and has to go through this decision about what his truth actually is. He's confronted with the realization that he's been handed a truth by the church, this established ideal of what the world is and what your truth is. But he's then confronted with the idea of some of that was a lie, or it could have been a lie, but you have to then choose which of these truths you want. That's not to say that both aren't wrong and both aren't right, but you can choose which one you want to believe in. You can accept the truth that you've been given, even though you know that it isn't the truth, because you've done some research into it, you've been given this opportunity to change that reality, but it's a much easier option. Or you can go with the truth that actually might be real, but it's going to really take a long, hard path for you to kind of reconcile yourself with the falsehoods that you've believed all this time and yourself. So there is definitely an objectivity of some of those. And then there's one other character, Sentenza, who's morally ambiguous, and he's definitely, he's an unreliable narrator. When you read in the book, you might think, I'm not really sure what his motives are, because I don't think he does himself, because he can run with the hounds or run with the hares kind of thing. He hasn't decided whether or not he's good or bad. He can be any of those. And I think that's really what I was trying to get across with the book is there is a subjectivity in what we believe and what we're told, and whether or not we just accept what we're told, or is there an alternative? If you scratch below this, can you find an alternative to what you're actually being taught or told?
Because there is that quite manipulative nature that you kind of evoke as well, with ideas of the truth or church and the state as what's presented. Because I think one thing that sort of stood out to me with that sort of manipulative idea of the truth is there's a bit where you talk about things that people believed with the old religion or the old magic, and how the church kind of just denied it, but didn't so much deny it as go, well, no, that was actually us, and kind of, and as if to make everyone believe, well, you were following the goddess the whole time, you just didn't know it, kind of thing. And the way that you kind of create that, I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, so it's the attempt to absorb. I think it goes through that idea of like paganism. It's so ingrained, or was so ingrained at the time when new religions like Christianity were coming along. How do you then break people's habits of being a believer in that pagan tradition or that druidistic tradition? Actually, what you can either just say, right, stop doing that now, and you've now got to do this. Well, that's not really going to work, and it's going to take quite a long time for you to try and establish that. What we'll do is we'll piggyback what you've already got. So if there is a religion or a tradition based on some of those old religions, actually, let's just morph it into ours so that we've got this. We don't have to break everything that you've already done, but we can just eventually convince you that was ours anyway, so you were already following our religion, but now it's our religion, it's no longer your religion. And that's very typically what the church has done in the book, is it's basically stolen some of the old religions, morphed it into their own, and then restricted what you were able to believe, or what you thought you were able to believe previously. So, and I think that has happened in various religions in real life, really. So it's just getting, I think in this book it's more visual because it is much more controlled, and it's still also very much enforced, whereas obviously some of the Western traditions of religion have fallen away a little bit and don't have that pervasive nature. In the book, it still is very pervasive in everybody's working day. Everybody's day-to-day life is very much controlled by the church, and I think I tried to set that up within there as well. Even from things such as travel, you can't travel from one area to another without permission from either from the church. You have to get a writ, a travel writ from the church to be able to move. And I think that was probably written at a time when we were all being asked about Brexit, and there was a restriction of the ideal of freedom of movement, and that comes within the book in terms of that's how it manifested itself, is actually they're very much controlled within their freedom of movement. People can't move from one city lord's estate to another because they don't want to lose that worker or that working class, and that's how it manifested itself in the book.
Yeah. We could talk about this all day, but I do have to ask you, since we're running a little bit low on time, about book 2, because you did mention that you are working on it.
Yes, so this is book. The Tenets of Truth is book 1 in a 4-book series called the Alytheian Cycle, and book 2, which is called A Splinter of Truth, is very much on the way. I'm hoping to get that finished in its entirety this year, later on in the year, and then look to publish early next year. So that's been really exciting, getting back into the swing of writing things. So it's been going really, really well. Very excited to revisit some of the characters from book 1, and then explore some of the characters that we heard of in book 1, but we never actually got to meet. But they'll figure much more in book 2. and then we'll move the religion along to its to the rest of the world. So yeah, we start to see book one is focused very much in the northeast of the book, and then this moves much more into the central of the book, and the church becomes a little bit more, or the back workings of the church become a little bit more to the front, as some of the dark and nefarious characters that we've kind of had suggested in book one will start to come out more, and then we'll get to see more of some of the other aspects of magic. So there are different types of magic that we hear about in book one, but aren't really investigated that much. We focus much more on the idea of wielding, which is kind of like a force magic. You can use it to club, to batter, that kind of thing, whereas there's also cognator magic, which is a mind control magic, and we'll see much more of that in book two.
Okay, looking forward to it then, very exciting. And of course the books to come after book two as well, which I won't ask you about because it's far too early for that, but I know that we can expect more, so I hope everyone's looking forward to that as well, because it sounds like it'll be very interesting. I think probably we can open up to some questions if anyone has anything that they want to ask Quillem.
Thank you very much. My question is, as someone who kind of writes a lot of unplanned work, or as yourself, as someone who writes, I do the same myself. But how much did you find, kind of, because you say you've got some planning, like for your ending and how a chapter goes and stuff like that, but the kind of macro stuff, the big stuff, like how much of your ending kind of changed as you were writing it? Like did you find the ending kind of stayed very stable? So how was that stuff later changed by stuff you discovered while writing, and then how was stuff at the start kind of changed as you wrote?
Yeah, I think that probably changed quite a lot as it went. It was quite fluid in as much as I knew the start, what I wanted to do. I knew the end. I knew this. I think I probably had the final scene written out or planned out in my head all along. So the bits in the middle were completely fluid, but we did have some changes to the ending that were not necessarily unplanned in terms of the final scene, but maybe how it fed into the final scene that were unexpected, and that's even from the first draft. So the first draft was set out and flowed reasonably well, but then on revisiting that, I think some of the characters changed in how they operated and how they then responded, and some of the motives changed a little bit as well. I think some of them became much more stronger characters than they had been previously. I think I remember talking with my developmental editor, and we very much were of the thought that this person was just the character who's now a much bigger character. At the time was just a way of carrying one message from one place to another, and didn't really have their own background or backstory. So we had to build that up, because it was really unfair in how that person was being treated, and not really given a platform to have their own thoughts and desires, and it just came across as really weak and one-dimensional. And I think that's probably part of my naivety in how I set about writing it at the time, and really didn't think about that. So it was really exciting to have that feedback, to understand that person was they were just superfluous, really. And I think now they're a much stronger character who will feature in different books in certain ways, but they also became and the strange thing is this particular character has the final act to save humanity within the book. So for her to have such a weak character line and character story was really surprising. When I reviewed it afterwards, it took that extra person with that extra set of eyes to look at it and say, "Ooh, do you realise that person's that weak?" So yeah, it's interesting to see how the different characters will change, and just changing some of their backstories or some of the motives really can have an impact to how the story or how the message of the story comes out. Might not change how the story ends up being. You still have that full circle or cycle of what you're trying to get to, the end point, but maybe the message will change, and that will change possibly the feel of the book as well.
And just a quick, just because something you said, Did you write quite chronologically? I think you said you wrote the ending, or did
Yep.
you wrote the ending and then kind of went back and filled parts in the middle, or?
No, it was all written chronologically. So it is all. The only times it would go out of chronological sequence was maybe if I'd got to a part in a chapter and while I was writing it, I started to lose a little bit of concentration in that and thought, listen, this isn't going in the right way. I need to skip to the next chapter, and that by doing that, I could continue writing and not get into that situation where people are blocked. So they're just sitting there trying to think their way out of a bad situation, but not really getting anywhere. So I'd just skip to the next chapter, write the next chapter, and then by writing the next chapter, it kind of gave you time to focus on, almost subconsciously, what should have happened in the previous chapter to get to influence this next chapter or influence the chapter beyond. So it gave you a bit of breathing space, but it very, very importantly meant that I was still being productive at the time, because I think you could get easily into a rut of just stopping and thinking, right, I'm blocked, I can't do anything now. What do we do now? Oh, I'll sit here and just, I'll go on Twitter. So, so I think it's really important to keep working at something rather than focusing on the things that are going badly.
Thanks very much.
Hello. I just wondered if there was a standout challenge for you. You mentioned that you really enjoyed the challenge of creating the characters. Was there one standout challenge that kept you awake at night?
I think so. I think probably writing from women's perspective, because the book is very much, each chapter is based on a particular character, protagonist, antagonist. So it's very much from their mindset, and it's, obviously there's the whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus. We have a completely different mindset, and it's trying to get that, or trying to get into that within the book, and writing from a woman's perspective is really, really challenging. And I think that's something that I did struggle with, and hopefully it's not too bad when you read it, but because I think it is difficult for us men to reconcile with that difference. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge, is writing from a woman's perspective. And I think men always find it difficult to do that.
Is this on? Yeah. I was just thinking, it's funny that women never say it's hard to write from a men's perspective, but I was just wondering on sort of timescales, like, because you were working full time as well, like, how long did it take you to draft, and then how long was it, like, through the editing process and so on?
I would say to write the first draft was probably about 2 years as a slow period, because it was sometimes just sometimes it might be 1 day a week, sometimes it might be no time at all. There were other periods where I was able to take some time off from work and just go and sit myself in Liverpool City Central Library and write 20,000 words in the week or something. So once I was in the flow, it was great. I could get a chapter done mostly every time that I was writing, even through the 1 day a week kind of process, unless it was a particularly long chapter. So that was probably about maybe 2 years. But then the really long period was getting it from that stage to then get to the second draft or third draft, or having somebody that wasn't a professional reader or editor to then read it and review it and then send it back. So whether you are using your peer groups, if you're using friends, family, it's a lot to ask them to go through this and read it. So I had some people, I had 4 people who were very, very, very good and kind in terms of how they gave me some really good feedback as it was going, and really, really hard and stimulating critique. We'd have to the discussion, we'd argue that 1 word out of the 5 chapters would be arguing, can you really have that there? Do you not think that you meant something else? Can you have a graduation in darkness? Those kind of minutiae, they were that was thankfully some of the critique that I was getting back, but it did take a long time. And that was probably the rate determining step for the whole book, was getting that kind of feedback so I could then inform or do informed edits. That's why when you then go to a professional, okay, you're having to pay for it, but you do get that much quicker. They have a timeline, whereas other people are just doing it on the days off or when they've got some downtime. So that, I think, was was the longest period. Book 2 has gone a lot quicker in terms of the writing process. So actually writing where I'm up to now, which is probably more than three quarters done, that has taken less than a year. So and maybe that's because my own drafting skills have been a bit more honed, and I have much more of an idea of what I want to do. I still am pantsing, but I think I've got more of an idea how I will structure them.
Just down the front.
Yes, one of the authors yesterday was telling us that they were very critical of creative writing courses, and they were saying, really, if you want to know how to write, then read what other people have written. Have you been influenced at all by other, do you get a good opportunity to read other authors, and have you been influenced by them?
I would say I'm certainly influenced by every book that I would read, and I don't think you can't be really, even if you don't like the book, then there are reasons why you don't like the book, so you'll reflect that in your writing. So to say that I'm influenced by every book, every article, everything that you read. Although saying that, I don't actually read as much as I used to read. I now listen to books a lot more, but I think I started off listening to books through the Storyteller magazines when I was a kid in the 80s, and used to get, I don't know whether anybody remembers them, but you used to get a little cassette tape that would go along, and it was a narrator who was reading the story, and then every now and again there'd be a little bell that would ding, and that meant you turned over the page, and that's how I've really learned to read. But I think really thinking about it, that's where my love of my audiobooks came, and then I got back into listening to books through my boss, my former boss in work, who had a subscription to one of these accounts, and we started convinced me to start giving it a go. I actually really thought that was something that was just a bit fuddy-duddy kind of thing. It was a really kind of, I remember seeing the audiobook section in libraries, but it was tiny, and there was some books that you'd never really, at that stage, think that you'd read. However, listening to books gives much more accessibility to some of the books that you don't think you would ordinarily read. Like, I don't think I would have read Moby Dick without it being an audio book, because I think it does look a bit daunting, but I think it's one of my favourite books because it's so interesting and so different in terms of the different styles. But I think listening to the books very much means that when I'm writing, I might have a different audio narrator in my head, narrating the words that I'm writing as I'm writing them. So I think a lot of it is Roy Dotrice, as I'm writing, who does the George R. Martin's Game of Thrones series, or it might be Anton Lesser. So nowadays it's also the audio narrator from a book, Trev Fleming. But yeah, I think everything that you read or listen to, or whatever the books that you have, definitely have some kind of influence on your writing. If not the writing style, then certainly you will have some features or books that you like to read, or the style or the ideas that you like to read, and they will definitely permeate what you do, if they're not necessarily influencing the style. So I wouldn't like to say that I'm ripping off anybody's style. Hopefully I have my own voice, but I think you obviously know what you like to listen to or like to read yourself, so that will influence what you're reading or writing.
Thank you. That's a very good explanation.
Hello.
Hello.
You set up in your book monotheism. You're a scientist, so you presumably believe in objective truth, but are you influenced personally by any ethical code or belief? Do you have a God?
I would like to. I think I had this discussion with Joanna Trollope on Friday night, discussed at length to say, I see people that do have a faith and the comfort and support that it gives them. However, I was brought up Roman Catholic, and I kind of fell out of favour and grace with that faith a long time ago. And I'm not really sure that I've ever found it again, but I really do feel its loss in some ways, and I do think that people that have a faith have that grounding and as I say, in that support. And I think it's lovely and wonderful to see that, and I can imagine it's such a comfort. Not saying that I'm lost or cold without it. I have the wonderful support of family and incredible friends, and I think, I suppose, if I have a faith in anything, I suppose it comes from that, and it stems from a faith in humanity, from the people that I'm surrounded by, and the love and the strength they provide.
One more question, if anyone has one. No? Okay. In that case, I hope everyone continues to attend any of the other events that we've got on, either with this festival or throughout the year. And please do check the web pages and the newsletter if you want to find out more information. But for today, I think we're just left to thank Quillem for a very wonderful talk. And again, he will be downstairs to sign books if anyone's interested. But thank you.